4:25 a.m., May 10, 1940, Staff Sergeant Henri Levaque stood on the uppermost platform of Fort Eben-Emael, gazing into the dimming Belgian sky. In just a few minutes, the morning watch would begin. The air was cool, almost peaceful. Then he heard it, a faint rustling, like wind through canvas. He turned, and his heart froze. 9 massive shadows silently glided from the darkness. No engines, no noise, just the ghostly swoosh of something impossible. Gliders. German gliders, racing directly toward the most powerful fortress in Europe. Levaque raised his rifle, but it was already too late. The first glider skidded across the grassy surface of the fortress, coming to a screeching halt. Men leapt out, paratroopers in full combat gear, moving with a precision that could only come from endless training. Levaque fired, once, twice. Then the world around him exploded in an inferno of light and thunder. In that moment, one of the most extraordinary defenses of World War II began. 780 Belgian soldiers against 71 German paratroopers, Europe's strongest fortress against the most revolutionary tactics of modern warfare. 31 hours that would change the world. Fort Eben-Emael was no ordinary bunker. It was a monument to Belgian engineering, built between 1931 and 1935 with a budget of 250 million Belgian francs. The fortress stretched across 900 by 700 meters. Built on a hill that rose 40 meters above the Albert Canal. The strategic location was perfectly chosen. From here, the Belgians controlled 3 critical bridges over the canal, the only crossings for a German invasion toward France. The fortress boasted 18 combat positions, each a small fort in itself. Steel gun turrets, up to 30 centimeters thick, protected the heavy artillery, 120mm cannons, 75mm guns, dozens of machine guns. The underground passages stretched over 4.5 kilometers, sleeping quarters, a hospital, ammunition depots, even its own power supply and ventilation system. Military experts from all over Europe had visited Eben-Emael and reached the same verdict. Impregnable. A frontal assault would be suicide. A siege would take months. The Belgian military leadership was convinced. This fortress would halt any German offensive, buying time for the Allies to organize. Major Jean-Louis Jottrand commanded the garrison of Fort Eben-Emael in May 1940. At 42 years old, he was an experienced officer who knew his men well. His garrison was supposed to consist of 2,200 soldiers, divided into 3 groups: 200 technical personnel, doctors, cooks, armorers, administration, and 2 groups of 500 artillerymen each. But in May 1940, the fortress was understaffed. Illnesses, expired terms of service, soldiers on leave. On the morning of May 10th, Jottrand had only 780 men available. And here lay a fatal problem that no one had foreseen. These men were garrison troops, gunners, not infantry. They had been trained to operate heavy artillery, maintain technical systems, fight in armored casemates. No one had prepared them to fight as infantry, to conduct counterattacks, to engage the enemy in close combat. This weakness would prove disastrous in the coming hours. The German planning for the attack on Eben-Emael began as early as October 1939. Adolf Hitler personally had shown interest in the operation, fascinated by the idea of capturing the impregnable fortress by surprise. The plan was bold to the point of recklessness. Captain Walter Koch received command of a specially trained unit, Assault Group Granite, 71 paratroopers, selected from the best soldiers of the German Luftwaffe. For months, they trained on a rebuilt model of the fortress in Hildesheim, practicing every hand movement, every motion, until they could attack the fortress in their sleep. But what was truly revolutionary was the weapon they would carry. Hollow charges, a new invention, explosive charges that used shaped explosions to create a metal jet that could penetrate up to 25 centimeters of steel. The Belgians did not know about this weapon. Their massive gun turrets, on which they were so proud, would prove to be vulnerable. And then the gliders. Hanna Reich, Hitler's personal pilot, had explained to the Führer, "Gliders in flight are nearly silent, no engines that can be detected by listening devices, no time for the defenders to react." The Belgians had installed a sophisticated system of sound-locating devices around the fortress to detect incoming bombers. But against gliders, these systems were useless. 9 DFS-230 gliders, each filled with 8 to 10 paratroopers and their deadly hollow charges, were towed into the air by Junkers 52 transport planes. At 4:25 a.m. on May 10, 1940, they detached over Belgian territory and glided silently through the dawn, their target to land directly on top of the fortress. Staff Sergeant Levac was not the only one who saw the gliders. Across the entire top of the fortress, German paratroopers suddenly jumped out of their gliders. Sergeant Andrew Rhodes, responsible for Casemate Maastricht 1, heard the crunching of a glider landing no more than 30 meters from his position. He reached for the telephone to alert Central Command, but the line was already dead. The Germans had cut the communication cables as their first act. Rhodes ran to the emergency exit of his casemate and pushed the door open. 3 German soldiers turned to face him. He slammed the door shut and locked it. His heart was pounding. What was happening outside? Inside the fortress, chaos reigned. Most of the soldiers were still asleep. It was Saturday. Many were not due to report for duty for several hours. The sudden explosions tore them from their beds. Major Jottrand stormed into the command room, trying to get reports from his combat positions. The telephone system was dead. Radio men were screaming in confusion. No one understood what was happening. And outside, on the surface, the 71 paratroopers were moving with deadly efficiency. Lieutenant Rudolf Witzig led the main attack on the northern gun turrets. His men ran towards the Maastricht 1 turret, one of the most powerful positions of the fortress, armed with 2 120mm cannons. The turret, made of massive steel, jutted from the ground, seemingly indestructible. Witzig's team placed a 50-kilogram hollow charge directly on the turret. The men ran for cover. Then the detonation, a deafening thunder, smoke and dust obscured everything. As the air cleared, the Germans stared at their handiwork. The 30-centimeter thick steel cupola had a gaping hole. The metal jet from the hollow charge had punched through the steel like paper. Inside the casemate, the scene was apocalyptic. The pressure from the explosion had instantly killed 3 Belgian gunners. 2 more lay on the floor, severely wounded, eardrums ruptured. Bleeding from their noses and ears, the massive 120mm cannons were damaged, useless. One of the strongest defensive positions in the fort had been eliminated in seconds, but the Belgians weren't giving up. Staff Sergeant Georges Cuvillier commanded the crew of Cupola Visée 1. He heard the explosions to the north, but still didn't fully grasp the scale of the attack. Then he saw them, German soldiers running across the surface of the fort. Carrying demolition charges, Cuvillier shouted orders. The 75mm gun of his cupola swung around. But here, a tragic problem revealed itself. The fort's guns were designed for long-range targets, tanks and troops far from the fort. The depression of the guns was limited. They couldn't fire at targets directly on the surface of the fort. The engineers had never envisioned an enemy landing on the fort itself. It had been unthinkable. Now, it was a deadly weakness. Cuvillier's men tried to fire through the embrasures with rifles, but the angles were impossible. The Germans stayed outside the dead angles, moving with the precision of men who knew the terrain by heart. Cupola after cupola fell, Visé 2 was attacked with a 12.5-kilogram hollow charge. The explosion killed 4 Belgians instantly. Nord, another powerful position with 2 75mm guns, suffered the same fate. The Germans placed demolition charges with surgical precision. Sometimes they threw smoke grenades into the embrasures before detonating the hollow charges to blind and disorient the crew. In the first 15 minutes of the attack, most of the fort's heavy guns were destroyed or damaged. Major Jottrand, in the command room deep underground, desperately tried to understand what was happening. Reports came in piecemeal, via runners. Soldiers sprinting through the corridors with news. Germans on the surface, cupolas destroyed, men dead or wounded. But how many Germans? How had they arrived? What was their objective? Jottrand made a decision. He had to organize counterattacks, drive the Germans from the surface. He summoned his officers. But here, the fundamental problem of the garrison became apparent. These men were not infantry. They had no experience with close-quarters combat tactics. House-to-house fighting, coordinated attacks in the open. Nevertheless, they had to try. Lieutenant Longdos received orders to advance through the north exit with 20 men and attack the German positions. The men armed themselves with rifles and hand grenades. Many hadn't fought in the open since basic training. They climbed the stairs to the exit. Longdos pushed open the door. Immediately, German machine gun fire hammered against the door. The paratroopers had all the exits under observation. One of Longdos's men stumbled forward, was instantly hit in the chest, and fell back down the stairs. The others huddled behind the door, trying to return fire. But the German MG post had a perfect line of sight. After 5 minutes of desperate fighting, Longdos pulled his men back, 2 dead, 4 wounded. The counterattack had failed. Further attempts followed. Staff Sergeant Levac, who had seen the first glider, organized a breakout attempt through the south exit. 15 men followed him. They made it 40 meters into the open before German fire cut them down. Levac was hit in the arm. Blood streamed through his torn sleeve. He yelled at his men to take cover behind a small earthen wall. But the German paratroopers advanced, throwing hand grenades. The Belgians had no choice. They retreated back into the fort, leaving 3 more men behind. Dead or dying in the morning light, Jottrand recognized the brutal truth. His men couldn't drive the Germans away. The paratroopers controlled the surface. But the fort itself, the massive underground facilities, those were still in Belgian hands. Maybe they could hold out until reinforcements arrived. Surely the Belgian army knew that Eben-Emael was under attack. Help would come. They just had to hold on. But the Germans had no intention of going into the underground tunnels. That would have been suicide, a fight corridor by corridor against defenders who knew every nook and cranny. Instead, the paratroopers focused on destroying every fighting position, blocking every exit, blinding and paralyzing the fort. And they had another weapon: terror. At 9:30 a.m., the Belgians inside heard a new sound, a piercing howl, swelling into a deafening scream. Stuka dive bombers. Junkers Ju-87s, the infamous Stukas with their Jericho trumpets, plunged toward the fort. 250-kilogram bombs detonated on the surface. The entire fort shook. Deep in the underground corridors, chunks of concrete fell from the ceiling. Light bulbs shattered, men cowered, hands over their ears, while the world above them seemed to tear apart. The bombs couldn't penetrate the fort's thick concrete cover, but the psychological effect was devastating. The men felt trapped, buried alive, while hell raged outside. At 10 a.m., a glimmer of hope. Major Jottrand received word via one of the few still functioning telephone lines leading to an outpost. The Belgian army knew about the attack. Reinforcements were on the way. A platoon of the 2nd Grenadiers, about 50 men, was already nearby and would attempt to reach the fort. Jottrand breathed a sigh of relief. 50 men weren't much, but they were trained infantry, soldiers who could fight. Maybe all was not lost. The grenadiers reached the edge of the fort around 10:30 a.m. Their commander, Lieutenant Delcroix, tried to assess the situation. He saw Germans on the surface of the fort, saw the destroyed cupolas, heard the gunfire. He knew he had to attack, relieve the fort, but how? His 50 men were too few for a frontal assault. He decided on a flanking attack from the east. The grenadiers advanced, crouching, using cover. But the German paratroopers were professionals. They had observers posted. Staff Sergeant Witzig watched the Belgian soldiers approach and directed his machine gun teams into position. As the grenadiers got within 200 meters of the fortress, the German machine guns opened fire, MG-34s, 900 rounds per minute, an uninterrupted hammering. The foremost grenadiers fell. The others threw themselves to the ground, trying to return fire. But the German positions were well chosen, half concealed behind the destroyed casemates. Sergeant Delcroix realized that any further advance would be suicide. He ordered the retreat. The grenadiers withdrew, leaving 8 dead and 14 wounded behind. The attempt to relieve Eben-Emael had failed. Inside the fortress, Jottrand heard the firing cease. He waited for news. Then a runner arrived, breathless, with the crushing message. The reinforcements had been beaten back. They were alone. The hours dragged on, noon after noon. The sun beat down on the battered surface of the fortress. Inside, the air grew thick. The ventilation system was still working, but dust from the explosions hung everywhere. Men sat in the dark corridors, nervously smoking, whispering to each other. How long would this last? Would help ever come? At 2:00 p.m., another reinforcement arrived. The detachment from Wonk, a Belgian unit from the nearby village of Wonk, about 200 men. Their commander had heard that Eben-Emael was under attack and decided to help. The 200 men marched towards the fortress, but then a new enemy appeared in the sky. More Stukas. The German bombers had spotted the Belgian approach. They swooped down like birds of prey on the densely packed column. The Jericho trumpets howled. Bombs fell. The Belgian formation exploded in chaos. Men threw themselves into ditches, ran in all directions. Bombs detonated among them, tearing men to pieces, throwing others through the air like rag dolls. The attack lasted only 10 minutes, but when the Stukas withdrew, the detachment from Wonk was broken. About 100 men, confused and demoralized, managed to reach the fortress and get inside through a side entrance. The others were dead, wounded, or had fled. These 100 additional men reinforced the garrison. But they were shell-shocked, many lightly wounded, their morale shattered by the airstrikes. The night of May 10th to the 11th was the longest in the lives of the Belgian defenders. Jottrand knew that he had to make a decision. He now had about 880 men in the fortress, including the reinforcement from Wonk, but most of his heavy weapons were destroyed. The Germans controlled the surface. What should he do? Part of him wanted to fight on. The fortress was still strong. The Germans couldn't get inside, but to what end? What could they achieve? At midnight, the German paratroopers gathered in one of the destroyed bunkers. They were exhausted. 71 men against a fortress of almost 900. They had lost 6 dead. Staff Sergeant Neuhaus, killed by Belgian rifle fire in the first minutes. Private Meyer died of wounds from a grenade fragment. 4 others, all young, all far from home. 15 were wounded, some severely. But they had accomplished their mission. The heavy guns of the fortress were destroyed. The bridges over the Albert Canal were in German hands. The way to France was open. Captain Koch had requested reinforcements, German pioneers. Engineer units with heavy equipment. They would arrive in the morning, in the fortress. The Germans made a decision that would terrify the Belgians. At 3 a.m. on May 11th, they began to place heavy explosive charges in the northern ventilation shafts of the fortress. Tons of explosives, wired and ready to detonate. At 3:45 a.m., they detonated the charges. The explosion was catastrophic. Deep inside the fortress, the ground was torn away from under the feet of the Belgians. A huge shockwave raced through the corridors. Concrete walls cracked. Ceilings collapsed. In Block 2, one of the northern sections, 12 men were buried under rubble. Others stumbled through dust-filled darkness, disoriented, deafened by the explosion. The ventilation system failed. The air became instantly thicker, heavier. Men began to cough, gasping for breath. Panic spread. Were the Germans about to blow up the entire fortress? Would they be buried alive? Major Jottrand struggled to maintain control. He ordered rubble to be cleared, wounded to be recovered. Medics worked in the flickering light of flashlights, trying to help men crushed under concrete slabs. The screams of the wounded echoed through the corridors. Jottrand knew that the situation was becoming untenable. His men were exhausted, many wounded, morale at rock bottom. The fortress was blind and lame, its heavy weapons destroyed, its ventilation damaged. And soon, German reinforcements would arrive. Heavy weapons, perhaps tanks. That would block the approaches. They could hold out for weeks, but at what price? How many of his men would die for a fortress that had already lost its strategic function? The bridges were in German hands. The German army was already rolling through Belgium. Eben-Emael was no longer relevant to the course of the battle. On the morning of May 11th, at 7 a.m., the German reinforcements arrived. The 51st Pioneer Battalion, equipped with heavy flamethrowers, explosive charges, and armored vehicles. First Lieutenant Witzig, who commanded the paratroopers, met with the Pioneer commander. They planned the final assault. At 9 a.m., the Germans began to direct flamethrowers into the entrances of the fortress. Jets of fire shot into the darkness of the corridors. The smell of burning oil filled the air. Belgian soldiers near the entrances fled deeper into the fortress, coughing, eyes watering. Jottrand knew it was over. He called his officers together. The vote was unanimous. They would surrender. But how? The Germans had to know that they wanted to give up. At 11:45 a.m., Captain Vamek, Jottrand's second-in-command, appeared at the main entrance. He was carrying a white sheet on a broomstick. Beside him stood the bugler Verviers, ready to blow the signal of surrender. A German soldier saw the white flag. The firing ceased. An eerie silence settled over the fortress. And Vamek stepped into the open, hands raised. German soldiers surrounded him, weapons at the ready. An officer stepped forward. Vamek spoke in French, then broken German. They wanted to surrender. Conditions. The German officer, a lieutenant from the Pioneer Battalion, nodded. No conditions. Unconditional surrender. Honorable treatment as prisoners of war. Vamek returned to the fortress, delivering the news. Jottrand nodded slowly. It was the end. At 12:30 p.m. on May 11, 1940, 31 hours after the attack began, the gates of Fort Eben-Emael opened. 780 Belgian soldiers marched out into the daylight, hands raised, faces dirty, uniforms torn. Many were weeping. Some just stared straight ahead, empty, exhausted. The Germans had them line up. Staff Sergeant Witzig stood there, observing the long rows of prisoners, 780 men. His 71 paratroopers, now reduced to 65 effective, had conquered the mightiest fortress in Europe. This story must never be forgotten because it shows us something fundamental about war and human courage. Numbers only tell part of the truth. 780 against 71 seems clear-cut. But war is never just a matter of numbers. Tactics, surprise, training, morale, all these invisible factors decide battles. If these historical truths are important to you, then support me with YouTube's super thanks, the golden heart below. Every super thanks allows me to spend weeks in archives, interviewing veterans before they disappear forever, digitizing rare documents. Help me preserve these stories for future generations, because if we forget what happened, we are doomed to repeat it. The defense of Fort Eben-Emael has become one of the most studied cases in military academies worldwide. What went wrong for the Belgians? First, the fortress was built for a war of the past. The engineers had thought of artillery duels, of long sieges, of frontal assaults. They had never foreseen that an enemy would land directly on the fortress. The blind spots of the guns, the inability to fire on their own surface, that became the deadly weakness. Second, the garrison troops were not infantry. Jottrand's men were brave soldiers, but they were not trained for the fight they had to wage. A tank grenadier battalion in the fortress might have been able to drive off the paratroopers, but artillerymen, suddenly forced to fight as infantry, were overwhelmed. Third, the communication. When the telephones failed, Jottrand lost control of his fighting positions. Each casemate fought in isolation, without knowing what was happening elsewhere. Modern armies have learned redundant communication systems are vital. A single point of failure can cripple an entire defense, but what the Germans achieved was as remarkable as the Belgian defense was tragic. The planning was meticulous. For months, the paratroopers had trained on a model. They knew every meter of the fortress. When they landed, they moved like men coming home, not like attackers in foreign territory. The hollow charges were decisive for the war. This new weapon made the thick armored cupolas, on which the Belgians had relied, obsolete. Overnight, the strongest fortresses in Europe became vulnerable. The Allies learned this lesson painfully. The Maginot Line also, France's vast fortress system, suddenly became questionable. If Eben-Emael could fall in 31 hours, what did that mean for other fortresses? The psychological effect was immense. The impregnable had fallen. The myth of absolute defense was broken. For the Belgian defenders, the surrender was the beginning of 5 years of prisoner of war camp. Major Jottrand was transported to Germany, spent the war in various camps. He survived, returned to Belgium in 1945, but the fall of Eben-Emael haunted him. Some accused him of surrendering too early. Could he have fought longer? Military investigations after the war concluded Jottrand had acted correctly. Further resistance would have been pointless bloodshed. The fortress had lost its function. To sacrifice his men for a symbol would have been insanity. Of the 780 defenders, 21 had fallen, 145 were wounded. Given the intensity of the attack, the surprise, the technological superiority of the Germans, these losses were relatively low. Jottrand's decision to surrender had saved hundreds of lives. On the German side, the 71 paratroopers were declared heroes. Captain Koch received the Knight's Cross. Lieutenant Witzig was promoted, showered with medals. The propaganda machine celebrated the victory as proof of German superiority, but the paratroopers themselves rarely spoke of Eben-Emael with pride. In later interviews, decades after the war, some expressed respect for the Belgian defenders. One paratrooper, whose name has not been handed down, said in the 1970s, "The Belgians fought with what they had. They were brave. They just had no chance against what we brought. That's no shame. That's war." These words capture something important. Courage is not just about winning. Courage is also about fighting when the odds are hopeless. The 780 defenders of Eben-Emael had that courage. Fort Eben-Emael still stands today. The Belgian government maintains the ruins as a memorial. You can visit the destroyed cupolas, see the holes that the hollow charges tore. You can walk through the dark corridors where desperate men once fought for their lives. Every year, thousands of visitors come. Military historians, school classes, veterans. They stand on the surface of the fortress and try to imagine what it was like on that morning in May 1940, when the gliders came out of the sky. The silence of the place is ghostly. You can almost hear the echoes of the explosions, the cries of the wounded, the rattle of the machine guns. History is not just numbers and data. History is people. 780 Belgian soldiers, most young. Many had just begun their military service. They had families, dreams, hopes. On a Saturday morning, they were thrown into a situation for which they had never been trained, against an enemy that was technologically superior to them. They fought as best they could. 21 of them died. Their names are on a memorial near the fortress. The German paratroopers, likewise, were people. 6 died for the victory. Corporal Neuhaus was 22 years old. From a small village in Bavaria, Private Meyer was 20, from Hamburg, a trained carpenter who dreamed of a future as a furniture maker. They died far from home, for goals they may not have fully understood. War takes the best of us, on both sides. That's the tragedy. There are no winners in war, only survivors and dead. The lesson of Eben-Emael isn't that the Germans were brilliant or the Belgians failed. The lesson is that war is chaotic, brutal, and unpredictable. Technology can decide battles. Surprise can nullify numbers, but in the end, it's people who suffer, on both sides of the line. Today, more than 80 years later, only a few veterans of Eben-Emael remain. The last Belgian defenders are in their 90s, their memories fading. Soon, there will be no direct witnesses left. That's why it's so important to preserve these stories, not to glorify war, but to remember, to understand what our grandfathers went through. To ensure that the sacrifices are not forgotten, the 21 Belgian soldiers who fell at Eben-Emael deserve to be remembered. The 6 German paratroopers, likewise, all were sons, brothers, friends. All were robbed of their futures by a battle that lasted 31 hours and changed the world. Fort Eben-Emael taught militaries worldwide, no fortress is impregnable, no defense is perfect. Innovation and surprise can overcome the strongest walls. These lessons were applied throughout World War II, the Normandy landings, the attack on Pearl Harbor, countless other operations built upon the principles demonstrated at Eben-Emael. But the most important lesson is human. Courage doesn't exist only on the winning side. The 780 Belgian defenders showed courage as they fought against overwhelming odds. The 71 German paratroopers showed courage as they landed on the most powerful fortress in Europe. Both sides deserved respect. Both sides were part of a story that was bigger than themselves. What impressed you most about this story? Many viewers have shared incredible family stories. Grandfathers who fought in Belgium, letters found in attics, war diaries that have lasted generations. Share your family history from this time down below. Each comment is a piece of history that we preserve together. The memory of Eben-Emael must not die with the last generation of veterans. It must live on through us, through our children, through all coming generations. Only in this way do we honor the men who fought and died on both sides of this tragic battle.